Yeah, welcome everyone. Today we have Dr. Martin Sears as the final speaker in our current ISPEC seminar series. So Martin is a postdoctoral fellow at ISPEC under the supervision of Professor Chris Kennedy, working at the intersection of energy analysis, macroeconomics, and deep decarbonization. Martin has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and economics from Mount Allison University and a master's degree in economics from Carleton University. And Martin was a fellow member of the Partnership for Ecological Economics, Economics for the Anthropocene, although Martin was at York University while I was at McGill University, and we've had a number of very interesting conversations about the fate of the world and energy and sustainability over the years. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk, and I'll hand it over to Chris to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I mean, I want to just echo what great it's been working with you, Martin. I'm still working with you, Martin. I mean, you've learned a bit of engineering and systems theory and industrial ecology here, and some great exchanges on macroeconomics and energy and capital to capital and all sorts of interesting concepts. So, a fabulous presentation in Ottawa just a week or two ago. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of that again.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone who's here and on Zoom for coming to the presentation. It's really great to talk about this with slightly more time than the presentation in Ottawa. And Tim, for you, I'll get to the doom and gloom, but I'll leave that to the very, very end. So as Tim said, I'm Martin Sears. I'm a postdoc at ISPEC, and today I'll be looking at an abstract and then not so abstract way of thinking about decarbonization pathways. And I think the formal title is the biophysical macroeconomic assessment of energy transitions. But we're going to start off with some pretty basic math. Thanks. So just the outline of this presentation, I'm going to be trying to basically knit together two different pieces of work that I've done here in my time at ISPEC. The first being kind of a discussion of what these pathways look like in the abstract, and then get a little bit into how we might construct one of these pathways using a macroeconomic model, using something called the stock flow consistent input-output approach. And at the end, I'll share some relatively preliminary results from this and talk about further work and maybe, most interestingly, some of the big questions that come up when we do this kind of work. So here's kind of, at least to me, the canonical image of decarbonization pathways. This is figure 2.5 from chapter 2 of the IPCC special report. And the first thing we might notice is that in almost all of these model runs, emissions start. After about 2020, they decline very, very rapidly. And for most model runs looked at in the IPCC, they in fact go negative for a substantial period of time after the half century. These runs range from, say, the low energy demand scenario, where there's not really a reliance on negative emissions, to scenario S5, where there's a substantial reliance on negative emissions. The point being, and the takeaway here is, while these things kind of wrap up a lot of different economic, technological, population assumptions, they all kind of look pretty similar, which is emissions have to do this, and they have to decline very, very rapidly. Next slide, please. So we're going to build our own really simple emissions pathway here today. We're all very lucky, I'm sure. So let's say that B is the remaining carbon budget. For example, it might be 500 gigatons CO2. Let's say we have GDP evolves over time at some growth rate G. We have a decline in emissions intensity at some rate R. We can construct this nice, very simple differential equation here, which governs the evolution of how much of our carbon budget we have left over time. And with a bit of math, we can solve this to get the rate of emissions intensity decline necessary every single year to keep that carbon budget, or to keep cumulative emissions over time just within that carbon budget. So again, once we do this, we're going to be able to build a pathway that just keeps our emissions in after time infinity just below that budget. Next slide, please. And lo and behold, it looks very similar to what we see in the IPCC. So the blue plot, or the blue line here, is the decline in emissions you need to just keep your cumulative emissions within the budget, which is our red line. And the point of showing this is that the number you get for year-over-year emissions intensity decline is very large. You can estimate it from the previous equation, and it's about 8.5% per annum. That's a big number, and we'll see some data for what is true historically, and it's quite a bit smaller in this next slide, please. In fact, we can use that same differential equation to estimate a bunch of other emissions reductions pathways. So if we look here, we have a whole whack of different budget assumptions. So for example, an initial budget remaining of 400 gigatons, and we can go all the way to 1300 gigatons. And again, for each of these, calculate the necessary year-over-year emissions intensity plans. For the most generous budget, 1300, which is substantially larger than the kind of main quoted one you get from the IPCC for the 50% chance, you need year-over-year intensity declines of approximately 5%. And of course, as that remaining budget is assumed to be smaller, that gets larger and larger. So for 400, we have something like 11.4%. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, even with the most generous assumption, that number is basically bigger than anything we've seen historically. So these graphs are a bit small, but the top panel here shows basically the percentage change in emissions intensity over time for the world and for various example countries. But at the global level, we see approximately a 2% decline in emissions intensity per year with the data availability from, I believe, 1960 to about 2018. So remember, under extremely generous assumptions for a large remaining carbon budget, the emissions intensity number we get is quite a bit bigger than what we've seen on average historically. And I say this because that's kind of important to give a sense of the scale of the challenge, right? We have a very unprecedented task ahead of us to bring that number down further. So the simple equation in the previous slide kind of masks a lot of really important and somewhat complex dynamics. So let's start with what is the dynamic environmentally extended input-output model. We'll look at this abstract thing here because this has relation to the kind of macroeconomic model that we'll be building slightly further in the presentation. So the kind of canonical simple environmentally extended input-output model goes something like this. We have a matrix of sectoral impact coefficients for various types of impacts. So we might look at the first row of this matrix DT, and these might be megatons CO2 per dollar of sector 1 output, megatons CO2 per dollar of sector 2 output, and so on all the way along. We have a matrix of inter-industry coefficients, which basically relate, or which captures kind of the inter-industry structure of an economy, how much each sector needs to purchase from every other sector to produce their outputs. And finally, we have a vector of final demands, which are things like consumption expenditures, government expenditures, and investment. Putting these three things together, we can get a way of calculating emissions per year and indeed a variety of other physical impacts per year, and have a way to decompose this into changes to the physical intensity, which we understand is changes in the underlying technology, which is the D, changes in the inter-industry structure of the economy, which we might think is changes in supply chain, and changes in the final demand, so changes in our consumption patterns, changing in government expenditure patterns, what have you. The point being that to reduce our emissions in the kind of pathways we've seen before, it's going to probably take some quantity of each of these things, right? We might have technological change represented by changes in our physical impact coefficients. We will almost certainly, and I'll get to this later in the presentation, have changes in the technical coefficients. And finally, we might have changes in what we do, with our consumption expenditures. We might buy less, gasoline for our cars and, buy more tickets on electrified trains. The point here is very simply, this is kind of the basic Leontief model. Take the inverse of this guy A here, you get the Leontief matrix. You take the matrix product of D times L times F of T, and you have, again, a vector of physical impacts. So we can play the same game we played earlier to get that kind of percentage emissions intensity decline per year with a slightly more complicated model. So in this slide here, I've rigged the model in such a way that we've taken into account moving from high intensity sectors for emissions to lower intensity sectors, that change in the F, but defined in such a way that the aggregate economic growth is held constant. So we shift around those elements of the final demand, but the total is the same. What this basically amounts to is saying, for a given rate of economic growth, here's some other stuff that's happening. And you can have a good time solving this slightly nightmarish equation, and we can again get a result for that intensity decline, but now allowing for things like changes in the structure, changes in the physical impacts, and changing for that final demand vector. Next slide, please. So I at least think this is kind of interesting. If you take a randomly generated A matrix, a randomly generated set of the kind of economy's interrelationships between sectors, and you take a whole bunch of them, 100,000, and you look at scenarios where you move from high intensity to low intensity at say 5% per year or 10% per year, you can then go back and calculate those intensity declines. The point of this slide is even under the most kind of generous assumptions, we have no economic growth and we move really quickly from high intensity to low intensity sectors. On average, you still get an intensity decline rate after taking into account those mechanics of about 5.5%. You do get a few edge cases, one might say, down around 3% for interesting starting conditions. Next slide, please. Of course, that's using a static A matrix. It's quite obvious that our inter-industry structure will evolve over time. So if we take one of those cases, the 2% growth case plus the 5% per annum change from high intensity to low intensity sectors, and run it forward in time, making essentially random changes in that matrix at each time step to simulate what one might hope is all possible pathways for that transition, you get this kind of future cone. So we might have movements where the inter-industry relationships actually lead to decoupling, or the requirements for intensity declines being larger than they were, and vice versa. Some of those transitions might lead to lower than expected, intensity decline requirements. But the point is, at least with this kind of calculation, we have a sense of when allowing for that inter-industry evolution, the kind of universe of possibilities we're looking at. The top and bottom of this kind of fan chart are kind of the ridiculous things we don't assume to happen. But even allowing for that evolution, we mostly know that that intensity decline rate is still hovering somewhere around 7% in this case for the assumptions. Next slide, please. Why do we care about all of that, aside from it looking cool in the graphs, is that these kind of decoupling or intensity calculations gives us a sense of magnitude. I haven't said any mechanisms, I haven't talked about the economy, I haven't said anything at all about that. All we've done is some math and we get a basic sense of the magnitude of the challenge, even after allowing for things like changing final demands and changing structure. And this approach kind of lets us examine emissions pathways across an absolute gargantuan number of assumptions, many of them completely implausible, but they're there anyways. So what we kind of take away from that is we have a simple model that tells us the challenge is quite difficult. We allow the model to relax some of its assumptions, and the challenge is still pretty difficult. So good news, I suppose. Tells us absolutely nothing about what those pathways would impact in other aspects. So we might have one of these trajectories that doesn't tell us anything necessarily without building a more concrete model. So the second half of this presentation is we're going to try and construct a macro model that might be able to produce one of those and hopefully show some pretty significant emissions reductions. So yep, we have to build a bigger macro model. And we need also a mechanism. As I said, the previous slides don't have any mechanism, they just do the basic math. So the very basic problem. We have a small remaining carbon budget. I think as of AR6 recently, it's something like 500 gigatons for the 50% chance. And that small budget makes meeting the carbon budget target really hard. There's a reason why we see massive deployments of negative emissions in some scenarios, because it's in fact exceedingly hard to bend your emissions curve down fast enough. And one strategy, and the one that'll be used in the macro model here, is the so-called electrify everything approach. So we have capital, we electrify it, we have energy generation, we make it basically decarbonize. And in a macro model like this, you can kind of be hand-wavy like that. Obviously, decarbonization and electrification is substantially more complicated than will become apparent here, not to mention things like hydrogen. But for now, we're going to take the approach of saying, let's electrify stuff and let's change how we generate our power. And we'll be doing it at a decent level of disaggregation. The North American inter-industry classifications at 2-digit level. So we'll be doing it for about 20 sectors. And the point is that sectors have, of course, their own idiosyncrasies. It's probably easier to electrify in the sector that's mostly sitting in an office space, and it's substantially harder to electrify things like heavy industry. Next slide, please. And I guess this is IceFix, so this is probably pretty obvious to everyone. But the kind of logic we have here is we might have some end-use technology, car, and it's powered by some sort of fossil fuel, gasoline. And we want to transition that to some other end-use technology, an electric car, charged from the grid, electricity. And importantly, we want to make sure that electricity is not coming from some factory burning coal. So we have a dual transition here, which is basically we want to take our capital stock, we want to electrify it. At the same time, we want to change the energy generation mixture from the back end. And the kind of basic questions here is, under what general conditions can we electrify everything, at least in the context of the models we built, and stay within a carbon budget? And is building any new fossil fuel infrastructure or non-electrified capital consistent with meeting said budget? And the sort of rephrasing of that question is, are stranded assets avoidable? Now, while we might have things like engineering and physics relatively well understood, economics and especially macroeconomics is, shall I say, somewhat more debated. And how we build our macroeconomic models has pretty substantial impacts on the outcomes they give us. And so, for example, this is a brilliant diagram from Mercure et al. Showing the impacts on GDP depending on how you essentially build your banking system in the model. So we might have a model, might have some macroeconomic components, it might be a black box and we don't look into it too much, but really we should, because these have really, really substantial impacts on how these things evolve. The point being here, the red line here, if you take the kind of conventional, let's say neoclassical approach to how money and financing works, you often get that climate adaptation, energy transition, all these things end up being costly, reducing GDP from a baseline. Excuse me, the governing logic here being something along the lines of, there's only so much savings floating around in the economy. We've transitioned some of that away from very productive things to less productive green technology. Therefore, our economy grows less than it might have been. The green line in the universe that I'll be operating in is different. It kind of works from a perspective in which money creation isn't just set above this kind of fixed amount of savings. And in fact, that money creation is endogenous to banking activities. And in this case, doing things like environmentally beneficial programs, building electrified capital, what have you, can actually lead to a boost in your GDP over time. And of course, it's not necessarily all that hard to see the logic in this. If you have spare capacity, you suddenly decide to do a bunch of new investments and financing is available, the I term in your GDP equation might increase, and hence the result is not super unexpected. Next slide, please. And in fact, this notion of money creation is kind of how, in some sense, central banks see it at this point. So here's a nice primer from the Bank of England in 2014, noting that the conventional story we have for money creation and financing, that we only have so much savings, that banks get money from the central bank and just expand it by reserves, doesn't really match how it works in practice. What really seems to happen is that banks extend a loan, they create an asset and a liability, and they endogenously create money this way. So there's not really the same limits that we're used to thinking of. So we're not having this very set number that we have for financing, we take away from productive things to do green investment. That doesn't necessarily happen. There are other controls for what banks can and cannot do, but oftentimes it's as simple as the bank extending a loan, you have a balance sheet expansion, and then you have endogenous money creation. So we're going to build a fairly simple model with this kind of financing story present. And this is based on the synthesis of what is called stock flow consistent macroeconomics, the kind of famous text is Godley and LeBlanc from 2007. And we're going to merge it with input-output analysis, hence the stock flow consistent input-output analysis title. And there's a very small but growing literature of stock flow consistent input-output models used for energy transition studies. You kind of have the first and probably most famous by Berg et al. In 2015. We have a PhD thesis, a very good one by Andrew Jackson in the UK, and a recent study by King. And I have a paper out this year as well, kind of building a very small version of the model that appears in the latter part of this presentation. So how does this work? You're never supposed to make slides too busy, and some of them get busier after this, so I apologize ahead of time. So the stock flow consistent input-output approach really kind of boils down to being careful with your accounting. So let's look at the top here. We have something, it's the transactions flow matrix. And this thing basically records the financial transactions between sectors of your economy. So for example, we might have households, we might have an energy sector, manufacturing sector, and governments. And in this top left corner, we have this negative CT. That corresponds to the outflow of expenditures by households in some time period to the production sectors. In this case, just for example, I have energy and manufacturing. The logic and the necessity of accounting says that the outflow from households in that time period obviously must be matched by the inflow by the other two sectors. Right? I can't spend money into nowhere, and money can't just come from anywhere. And so this logic applies across the entire balance sheet. Similarly, if we look down the household column, well, households receive an inflow of things like wages. They pay taxes to the government, and whatever they have left, if it's positive, gets shoved into savings. In this case, we have just money for simplicity. Of course, if your wages and your tax paying, or sorry, if your consumption and your taxes are bigger than the wages you earn in this world, well, you might actually draw down that money instead of adding to it. The point being here is everything goes somewhere and everything comes from somewhere. And Godley, I believe, is famous for saying there's no black holes. Stuff just can't materialize or disappear in this kind of models. Where the input-output part comes in is we notice that there's some of the same stuff as in this input-output table here that appears in this transaction flow table. So for example, here we have some inter-industry transactions, our Z11 and Z12. Well, we know that the energy sector is going to, I guess, sell Z12 to the manufacturing sector. So it records that in its column. This is Z12 here, but it has to take away its inputs that it itself purchased from the manufacturing sector. But by symmetry, this is reversed from the manufacturing sector column. And so ultimately, these things sum to zero. And the rule here is that all rows and columns must sum to zero so that every kind of flow in the economy is accounted for. And so this is a kind of simple example of how you can put these two different accounting structures together to both capture the kind of standard inter-industry story in this kind of airtight accounting structure. Next slide, please. So what are the key premises of this approach? My favorite key premise of this is that you can put monetary and physical variables together if you spend a lot of time doing dimensional analysis on the board in your SFCIO office. But this is important because in some macro models, you have what might be considered dimensionally dubious quantities. So if anyone's familiar with the Cobb-Douglas function, it is very difficult to understand the, I guess, dimensional analysis at play in such a thing. So I've spent a great deal of time ensuring that the dimensional analysis, linking together phenomena, we might have things that are in power terms, as well as things that are in dollars per year, that these things play nice together. And we have, I guess, the kind of key assumptions for the model. So each sector of the 20, which I'll show you in the next slide, are assumed to operate electrified and non-electrified capital. Electric power is supplied by utilities, and that is made by a combination of what we might say is renewable and fossil fuel-based generation capacity. And new capital, construction is financed via loans from a private bank and retained earnings held by the firms making up the sector themselves. So retained earnings basically is I make some profits, some of that I hold aside to finance capital construction. We assume that our households consume out of disposable income and some past savings, and that households also hold assets or these savings in the form of just inert money and some interest earning deposits. You can make these models much more complicated and have households hold all sorts of exotic things. I've kept it relatively simple because it's not necessary for the story. The government purchases outputs, the government expenditures, taxes households, and importantly for the story noted before, acts as kind of both a borrower and lender for the banking sector. So it might borrow in certain conditions and also shore up the bank's balance sheet and others. And maybe kind of the critical differing assumption from the models we built here and kind of many that some of you might be familiar with is I don't include any what I call exotic optimizations, no perfect foresight or information, implausible agent behavior, what have you. And I was thinking of how to express this earlier today, and I've come up with this pithy statement. The people in my model are dumb. They don't do any of the heroic feats that you often find agents do in macroeconomic models. They're, in some sense, as blind and myopic as we seem to be at some levels when trying to make policy. Next slide, please. So, what are the actual model sectors? Well, there'd be an NAICS 20 with slight changes. So, I have taken the petroleum and coal products part of manufacturing, made it its own sector, and put construction and the remainder of manufacturing as their own sector, chiefly for the purposes of assigning investment to these sectors. Next slide, please. So the model basically works at the high level like this. We start from some notion of capital stock energy requirements. We're calling that each sector has electrified and non-electrified capital. We move and build a physical input-output table. We then work with the prices, and I'll show this in the next slide, to get a monetary input-output table. We combine it with the stock flow structures noted before. We get this 20-sector SFCIO, and out pops things like emissions, investment data, capital stock directors, what have you. Next slide, please. Kind of maybe the most important dynamic in this work is how to make that A matrix endogenous. Way back at the beginning of this presentation, we looked at something like a random evolution of our A matrix. Obviously, it's not going to be like that in reality, but to achieve decarbonization in a model like this, we need to be able to not only change final demands for things that use fossil fuels, but also that inter-industry structure. I won't go through the math here, it's not extremely interesting, but basically what happens is the model will evolve in such a way that the inter-industry requirements for the output of that fuel manufacturing sector I made go to zero over time as sectors electrify, and as the utility sector moves away from fossil fuel-based power generation. And I'm happy to answer your questions on this later if someone has it, but I'll skip over the horrible math because there's more than the next slide. The actual model has a transactions flow table, a little bit more complicated than before, but it follows basically the same premise. So again, we have our households will spend some amount CT in each time period, and this is divvied out to each of the 20 sectors, in this case, just by a very simple mechanism. In the final model later on, a bit more sophisticated and calibrated to the Canadian data. The sector receives, or the household sector receives wages from all 20 sectors. It's again taxed by the government. It has interest on deposits. It gets bank profits, though I think in most ones those are set to zero. It gets distributed profits from the industrial sectors, and it stores its savings as a combination of money and deposits. And the rest of the logic basically works the same way. So our industrial sectors here are separated into sectoral, current, and capital. Basically, the story here is that they get an inflow of funds in the form of consumption and government expenditures. They have to pay wages. They have to invest in new capital. They have to buy inputs, and they sell out to other sectors. They pay interest on loans. And finally, whatever profits they have are distributed both to households and held in the capital account in the form of retained earnings to finance investment. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at 5 scenarios with this structure. The first is most new investment is in electrified capital, and most new investment is in energy generation is renewable. The next 2 is no new investment in non-electrified capital or fossil fuel-based power generation. And the last 3 are what will give the game away, calling maybe the stranded asset scenarios. The third one is we kind of get ambitious and we build a bit more energy capital, electrified and renewable capital than might be required. And the last 2 are we start tearing down our fossil fuel assets faster than they would normally depreciate. In the first scenario 4, we tear them down at about twice the rate. In the fifth scenario, about 3 times the rate. Next slide, please. The mainline story here is with the model, as I noted at the beginning, it's really, really difficult to keep your emissions down when you don't use negative emissions. So panel 1 here shows across those 5 scenarios the emissions trajectories. So when we still have some new investment in fossil fuels, in scenario 1, the blue, we do see emissions declines normalized to 1 here across the model run, but they're not very significant. And as you work your way down the intensity of the scenarios, you get more substantial emissions reductions. In that final scenario 5, pretty aggressive ones, sort of in line with that graph we saw at the beginning. Slide 2 tells us if we've succeeded or not. So out to 2050, not assuming negative emissions, I'll say more about it at the end. How did we do? Well, scenario 5 is the interesting one where we kind of tear down our fossil fuel capacity much faster than we used to, and you can kind of just about stay within that budget. And to note, the budget assumed here is 14 times the initial year emission. That's a rough approximation for what our yearly fossil fuel emissions are to the 500 gigaton budget. So that's a rough budget here, but it's basically accurate enough for our purposes. The point is, it's really, really hard to make a model even with generous assumptions reduce emissions really quickly. This is kind of the starting point of the story. Even with kind of none of the standard Nordhaus style optimization assumptions, it's still hard. In this scenario here, we have no new investment whatsoever starting immediately in fossil fuel infrastructure, and we're just going out and we're depreciating, getting rid of that stuff well before it ordinarily would have to. So this tells us something a bit interesting, right? It's quite a challenge. In terms of investments in utilities, which is going to be doing a lot of work, these are relative to the baseline, which is the first scenario. So when we have no new fossil fuel investment, we have 30-odd% increase over baseline. But when we start tearing down our fossil fuel capital, that's what we see. We have this kind of substantial upfront investments, and especially in scenario 4, which is confusing with scenario 5 everywhere else. Not only do we have this high upfront investment, but it actually increases over time before declining to facilitate the kind of faster transition requirements made by, going down our fossil fuel-based infrastructure faster than otherwise would. The impact is not necessarily large with the model test calibration, but we can kind of see this impact on the utility sector profits, especially in scenario 5 here. As they take out a whole pile of loans to finance the new construction they need to do, their profits are suppressed for, in this case, quite a large amount of time, as they're now paying higher interest on those loans, and eventually they recover beyond the model. Next slide, please. So it's a bit of an uninspiring graph, but what happens in our manufacturing sector that produces fuels? There's kind of only one really important story here. Well, you're saddled with some kind of fixed costs, but your production is going down substantially. You don't want your output anymore. But you still have payments on loans, you still have wages to be paid, and other kind of costs associated with production. So what ends up happening is the unit cost of producing output, which is just all your costs divided by your real output, starts getting quite large in this sector over time. And consequently, profits in this sector, which are normalized to 1, decline over the model run and eventually go negative. Next slide, please. However, what we want to take away from this is GDP doesn't just decline like we're used to, because we have that assumption that finance isn't necessarily constrained. While this is all happening in our fossil fuel sector, it's being offset by the activity in others. And in the end, because we assumed I should have said this, these scenarios were done without long-run growth in mind. We see a very minor increase in growth over the scenario, reflecting slightly enhanced investment activities for utilities, offset by the kind of massive decline in fuel production. But the point being is that you just kind of play with basic accounting rules. There's no reason for your GDP in this sense to decline. And this is something that has been noticed, especially in that Mercury et al. Paper, and it's kind of nice to see what we'll get to. Next slide, please. So with the test parameterization, we get a pretty obvious result. You get stranded assets, it's almost certainly unavoidable. And even with some pretty generous assumptions, without assuming negative emissions, it's extremely hard to bend that emissions curve down fast enough to stay within the budget. This leads us to kind of a few big questions. The stranded assets are unavoidable. What do policymakers do? I have no idea what the answer is to that, by the way. Another question I have no idea how to answer is, how do we ensure the availability of sufficient financing? One thing that's important in this story is that if you want to transition as fast as possible, your sectors need to be able to, I guess, retrofit or build new capital, and your power generation sector needs to be able to build a whole pile of new generation capacity. So in reality, it's, I believe, somewhat more complicated to do this, especially in some parts of the states than is represented here. So this is actually quite a complex question. What's not recognized here is how do we actually know that I can just cite a bunch of new renewable capacity and just merge it into a grid? That's it's not my specialty, but I'm aware that that's somewhat complicated. But the kind of assumption I want to end off on, and one that I think about fairly constantly, is it's one thing to build a model where we have even simple behavior, not necessarily the really astounding behavior that's often in these models. But to keep ourselves honest, how well might even these simple behaviors map into the future? I was reading a story the other day of wet bulb temperatures being exceeded in parts of the world. And so there's a lot of complex things coming down the pipeline in terms of behavior, sociology, policy, a whole host of possibly nasty things, none of which can be represented easily or at all in models like this. So the kind of question to modelers and indeed myself is, do we have faith in our behavioral assumptions? Right? I'm not a sociologist, I don't really understand much of that work. But it seems to me that we might do a lot of work like this, but it's hamstrung in some sense because we can't necessarily predict possibly very different evolution of behaviors that might occur, which is part of the reason why I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of agents who optimize over very long time horizons or have perfect information, because it doesn't necessarily seem to mesh well, at least how I see the world unfolding at present. Unstated here also is that this was done without assuming negative emissions. And as we saw in the very beginning, negative emissions are assumed in a big way for most trajectories. The point of doing something like this kind of flows from Glenn Peter paper from 2016, which says something along the lines of negative emissions are a possibly very unfair high stakes gamble. We don't actually really know, at least to my knowledge, if they'll actually materialize or will work the way we think we do. And so when we generate all these pathways, assuming their immense deployment afterwards, we're betting maybe a very unfair bet of the future. If they don't materialize and we didn't reduce emissions fast enough, well, now we've dumped that in the future with the technology that didn't materialize. Of course, if they do materialize, then the difficulty of these results is not nearly so complicated, because we could just kind of make those emissions decline much faster. But I think these kind of big sociological questions, and also the questions of how much we might rely on technology that may or may not manifest, are actually really quite important in this kind of studies. And there's some notices. But anyways, thank you for listening.
Okay, do we have any questions online or in the room? None so far.
It was a great talk. Thanks for that.
I think we have current problems right now. You want to ask a question, Carmen?
I had a whole bunch of questions. I'm trying to pick pick one. I was interested maybe on, because you mentioned the monetary theory part of it, and we're going through a stock market decline, etc. What in your models does it capture kind of the it always seems to me as an engineer that our economic system is this horribly unstable system, and you'd be fired if you ever tried to say this was a control system with interest rates. So does your model capture that kind of instability in the system, or is it a fundamentally stable, the equations you're showing?
So this model here is fundamentally stable. It's entirely possible in this framework, to my knowledge, to build in that kind of instability. But I definitely haven't got it in this one. But that's a really good question. The approach, the stock flow consistent approach in particular, again, isn't predicated on those kind of ingenious agents. So it's very plausible that you can build in dynamics that lead to collapse, that lead to what have you. But it's not present in this right now. Good question.
And when you say it's consistent, then, so if I understood the matrix formulation there, like money flows between governments and people making it, right? And you kind of accounted for that in all its units, correct?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
I don't know, it was back a number of slides where you, like the fundamental basis of your model, and you were talking about unit consistency. So the stock flow consistent input. That's like what, so for example, whatever X trillion dollars gets wiped off the stock market, for example, is that represented here somehow? Or like, there's an article in CBC around like, does cash that disappear? So is that represented here? Or I'm thinking like my value of my stocks has declined, so I can't pay the government the same taxes, for example. Like, how does that manifest here?
So this is a pretty simple example, but in general, this works that all assets and liabilities comes in pairs. So in not shown here is that you also have, at least in the discrete time version, something called a revaluation matrix. But if I have some, let's say, monetary assets, let's say I have a loan that I've extended, simple example, and someone pays back a whole bunch of that principal. All assets and liabilities, because they must be a pair, will increase or decrease simultaneously. So in this case, if I had in a more exotic model, I had my households holding, I don't know, some sort of stocks. Well, that's a liability to someone else somewhere in the model. So if one part of that decreases, the other part does. But that's handled with just a kind of an additional matrix that's not super interesting. But again, the absolute magnitude of these things is not really all that important in this accounting approach. All that matters is everything comes with an opposite signed entry somewhere else in the accounting system.
Okay, I get that. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Any other questions online? All right, so I have one. Actually, I've got many, as usual.
Right.
But I'll keep it simple. So you mentioned electrify everything, and I think it's very clear now that a lot of the policies are focusing on this pathway. But there is an issue of diminishing returns, because we tend to electrify the sectors where the cost benefit is highest for doing so, and then progressively work our way down that sequence until we get to the hard to abate sectors, the things like high temperature process heat, especially where the fuel itself is a reagent, like steel production, transportation fuels. And so there's an emissions abatement cost curve. And the further you go along that curve, the more uncertain it gets. So what is your sense about the role of uncertainty here? I think like a lot of modeling is still in the realm of deterministic analysis. And how can we start to create models? And I think that the stock-flow consistent models are an excellent tool. How can we start to think using models in a more probabilistic sense to start to account for these uncertainties?
That's a great question. So just to note, that dynamic obviously isn't here. There's a very extremely technical answer to that question, but in some sense, well, let me think in terms of what the model is here. Right? I have a sector that just happily builds out electrified capital and stops investing it's not electrified, and it doesn't really have any complex increasing costs for that. So one pretty obvious way you could do that in something like this is the closer you get to having electrified all of your activities in a sector, there might be some partially baked things within the sector. You have basically some sort of stochastic thing that says the costs will increase over time. You don't quite know what they are, and that would happen. And you could play this game for each of the sectors. So obviously, when I mentioned transport, that's a lot harder to electrify than office space. So these things could be put in here. I don't the exact mechanical answer, but it would certainly make the analysis a lot more sensible, more rigorous. This is kind of, it's a bit grim to say, but this is kind of an exceptional best case version where we don't run into problems where you actually just can't really electrify without gargantuan effort. To be able to do that, you then need to add in things like finding other ways to fuel yourself, and that's beyond the scope of this at present.
Yeah, the thing that makes me uneasy is the requirement for the projections of various things in the future, cost curves and so on, and also often a lot of ceteris paribus assumptions where the wider system remains the same. As you were saying, the things that are not included in the models that we kind of know are coming down the pipeline and are going to come along and throw all of this stuff out the window, and we're dealing with being a totally different picture. But it's, I face exactly the same problem. It's very hard to quantify these and get them into a model. So modeling, in a sense, is sort of, it faces limitations. And often, do you have any thoughts on how to make the outputs of modeling more actionable, because often models sort of demonstrate more what can't happen than what will happen. And what can't happen is often not, actionable in the policy setting. And how do we get past that barrier to start influencing policy using models? It's a question that I grapple with often, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that.
That's quite a good questions in my mind. So there is, it's going to take a while to ask this. I'm going to cycle through the questions. Forget me this time. So there is one or two really, really big versions of things that kind of look like this, not quite. But when I was a consultant, I worked in something called E3ME, which is a global scale macroeconomic model. And during my time I was working there, they had something called FTT power, FTT keys that had, it's a physically based system. I don't really know the details, but it had kind of those learning curves in it. So that's definitely something you can do when you've been working on the model for 40 years. But that's an econometric based model, which is a bit different. So that actually does exist. To answer kind of your second set of questions, goes back to a conversation that I heard while I was there, which was, if our model predicts a recession or a crash, do we believe it, or do we think we screwed up the model somewhere? And that's kind of haunted me ever since, because we get bad outcomes in these things, and we assume that it's an error in one of the 10,000 lines of code. Why? Because it's really, if you want to see interesting things like that, you have to make it a possibility for the model to show in the first place. So from a very personal perspective, I have absolutely no idea how to program social breakdown to this thing. Not the foggiest, right? I had a spiel about how my agents aren't doing all these fun things that are often these models, but my agents still don't want a revolution 20 years down the line. It sounds strange to say this. I'm not sure in the kind of worst case scenario or kind of scenario breakdown that we might be thinking of, that these models will ever be able to tell us in those things. There's too much random weird things that could happen in reality that are not, in some sense, honestly capturable in something like this. We want to be, in quotation marks, rigorous. It's very hard to put in some kind of screwy scenario that emerges from some one-off event that happens. So I don't actually know if they ever will be useful for being actionable for things that we might be both quite nervous about.
It makes the case for having a sort of pluralism of modeling perspectives and approaching things that way, rather than treating any one model as a sort of forecast in the future.
It's interesting though, if I can jump in on this, because we went to this conference in Ottawa where you go Bank of Canada, Environment Climate Change Canada, and they built their model and they run their models. And they tell stuff to government. And they usually tell the government that the GDP is going to go down, right? but that's just a modeling thing, and it doesn't have to. So there is, they have a voice. The models have a voice. One of the challenges is you don't particularly like their models.
Well, but I mean, they don't just have a voice; they have kind of the voice in some sense. These things are really, to the extent that we might be suspicious of some of the mechanics, not in maybe the physical side, I can't speak to that, but to the kind of economic assumptions things. To put it diplomatically, to the extent that we can be suspicious about those, these things hold quite a bit of sway. So like you're saying, it's interesting to see that they have their own in-house, very complicated black box models, some of which might be fine, some of which we might disagree with, but they hold astounding influence as far as I can tell. And so we kind of papered over the deep, crushing uncertainty of the future with maybe unjustified, shall I say, a sense of certainty from our mathematics that are questionable.
Yeah.
So yeah, and because of to answer your actual question, it's not really necessary. It's not sensible to just throw our hands up and say it's not going to be useful, because we know that these things are used. So in some sense, even if we don't think they're perfectly reliable, shall I say, because of their use, it's incumbent on us to actually work on them.
Maybe we have a couple questions on my half.
Okay, I'll just do one question. So the question is about optimization, and engineers like to optimize, and economists like to optimize. I know it's great that you haven't been in utility maximize, profit maximize in the model. I'm cool with that. I like the scenario, but it does beg the question. And I'm not suggesting you optimize. You've got a model with a lot of levers, And we probably haven't explored all those movements. And I'm just thinking things like huge amounts of taxes and big government spending. I mean, just to go back to the old world, you know, I mean, there's a lot of different ways economies can evolve that are radically different from what we've got now. Any sense of what levers you haven't explored that you might think might just help a little bit in this decarbonization game?
Time to plug a paper I wrote recently. Yeah, so the one thing I was at in the previous paper was there's lots and lots of talk about something called degrowth for those who are familiar with it. And I want to take a model like this and see what actually happens when you just impose degrowth on it. And I used exogenous government expenditures to say, well, we're going to increase GDP, keep it more or less level, or decrease it dramatically. And that, I mean, probably not surprisingly, has a significant impact on how these things evolve. If you make the economy degrow relatively quickly under some generous assumptions, it's a whole lot easier. The intensity of the climate plan is a lot smaller. But you're right. I mean, there's not one kind of single way to run this thing in the future. This is in fact a ridiculously stupid number when you get to 20 sectors. And it's kind of about paring it down to what you want to look at.
Yeah. Because the engineers are fine, and go back to the very first part of the presentation, they said that there's a bunch of simulations, 100,000 simulations that come, and only very few of them can get us where we want. As an engineer, that's where we go right away. We go, all right, let's go there. let's fix the economy, right?
But I guess here, I mean, like that, I feel more comfortable with optimization or that kind of approach when it's on non-human machines that we kind of have some sense of it. And I can see the lure of optimization, but it's really, to me, quite a leap of assumptions to take the optimization logic we have for something like, say, a physical system and assume that our humans in our model, which is the thing, is doing the same thing. Yeah. So I'm more comfortable with optimization in some places than others. Actually.
So we have a question from Charity. Can this model be expanded or used to calculate a sort of break-even cost for negative emissions technology to be counted as successful? For example, if we want to pick between competing technologies.
As its present form, no. Can this be hypothetically done? Yes. I mean, we might have some. Oh, okay. I mean, I'm not going to throw the question back, but in a model like this, we have to say, where do negative emissions, who's building it? Where is that arising from? But it's worth noting something that cost is only one side of the equation, right? And one thing that becomes very clear with models like this is doing something like negative emissions isn't just dumping unilaterally a cost in your economy, because of course, you know what, someone is now putting out a whole bunch of investment dollars to make it, that's generating activity, blah, 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 blah. So we can't necessarily just think of it in terms of costs. We can look at costs in terms of an individual sector saying, I could invest in this electrification thing, or I can invest in this abatement technology. But at the kind of macro level of this, it's harder to think of just costs in isolation. But in its present form, no, but yeah, we're not that burden to figure out how to put that in for sure.
We have another question from Elaine Perkins. To facilitate innovation and the spread of low emission technologies, which can be used in various contexts worldwide, doesn't it make sense to advocate for open source access, strong government intervention to reduce intellectual property claims and secrecy, along with much greater ease of financing worldwide? Informal sector innovation has vast potential in the global south.
I'm going to have to defer to Ellie on that one. So I think the answer is probably just yes. The thing about financing, and I don't necessarily know how much about this in terms of the global south, but to make the results in a model like this, like I said in the beginning, is reliant on freely available, is reliant on, shall I say, easily accessible financing. So that story that's being told here for a single country, nominally Canada, disappears entirely when you don't have the funding to make it happen. Right? Ultimately, I have to build capital, has to be financed somehow. If you take one of the prime levers out, well, then you just can't do it. So it's like I agree with Ellen in that sense. As for the patent law, that's beyond my area of expertise by a few orders of magnitude. But I guess if we do come up with technology to make some of these complex things happen, to me, I would agree. It seems pretty obvious that it has to be really available.
So that's it for our online questions. And I have another, just a simple technical question. If you go back, I think a couple of slides, So I'm curious, in your Stockwell consistent model formulation, you're creating this link between the physical accounts and the monetary.
Yep.
Yeah, here it is, that previous slide. Yes, this one. So you're taking your capital stock into requirements, and then you're translating this into a monetary representation and then running it forward into the future. Does this effectively assume that prices of various commodities remains constant over time?
That's a good question, and no, it's a fantastic question. So each sector in this model sets prices on a markup scheme, which is you have a markup on your unit costs. So unit costs in the model we talked about earlier are things like wage payments, interest payments on loans, your payments to other sectors for inputs. So in each time step, the model will say, all right, my price I'm going to set for my output is some percentage markup on how much it costs to produce the thing. How the coefficients end up working is they have the physical requirements baked in, but they also have the relative price of the sector and the purchasing sector. Those things are allowed to freely move in the model. So in part, you get an evolution due to the changing physical requirements, and in part, you get a change due to the evolution of relative prices.
So I'm wondering, in a model like this, where can, because many of these input commodities, if we look at the physical accounts, are non-renewable, and they're on a declining quality curve, requiring more capital inputs to produce the same quantity of output. And that obviously affects the A matrix, because you get this intensification of inter-industry linkages. Can that supply side constraint be represented in a formulation like this?
Yes, so very specifically, if I just have more capital requirements to produce some given amount of stuff, that raises the unit cost of production. That means that sector's price increases, but because every sector's price in a kind of model like this is dependent essentially on every other sector's price, you make one thing more expensive because it's physically more intensive, or with declining quality curve, that influences the evolution of all the other prices, which I think is kind of, I should have stated this more carefully, but that leads you to being able to see how, in some sense, an energy price spike might flow through, because those prices have to be related to each other because they're buying from each other. So that's, yeah, theoretically already capturable in a model like this, but I don't have those defining quality curves in it yet, or maybe ever.
And the final wildcard question: does this terminate economic growth?
Actually, no.
I mean, if you were to consider this raising of prices among all of the inter-industry exchanges and the supply side constraints, prices rising, prices of all of the input commodities rising in time, especially those that are more limited in supply, like petroleum, like lithium. Does this have a detrimental effect on the growth rate?
So I haven't actually simulated that, and I can't answer that without doing it. I suspect it probably does. If nothing else, households are suddenly facing things they can't afford and that have basic requirements, yada, yada, yada. I don't actually know. I'd have to go back and simulate it, but that's an excellent question.
Any others? Okay, I think we're at time, so thank you, everyone. And thanks again to Martin.
Thanks, everybody.